The flickering glow from the fireplace cast long, dancing shadows across the Oval Office, illuminating the resolute face of President Thorne as he stared into the dying embers. Outside, a cold, relentless rain lashed against the bulletproof windows, a fitting storm for the tempest brewing on the world's stage. On the polished mahogany of the resolute desk, a single document lay open, its crisp paper a stark white against the dark wood. It was a communiqué, delivered with the diplomatic subtlety of a sledgehammer, from the combined powers of the United Nations and the World Economic Forum. It wasn't a request, it was an ultimatum. They demanded an end to America's strict new border policies, a surrender of its control over its own currency, and an alignment with their global climate agenda, an agenda that would cripple American industry and drain the Treasury. It was, in essence, a demand for capitulation. President Thorne leaned back in his leather chair, the old wood groaning under the weight of his contemplation. He ran a hand over his face, the fatigue of the long battle etched into his features. But as he looked up, his eyes fell upon the portrait of George Washington hanging over the mantel, his gaze stern and unyielding. In that moment, the president's exhaustion hardened into something else entirely, pure, unadulterated defiance. He reached for the document, his fingers closing around its edges. They had sent him their final offer, their vision for a world where nations were merely administrative districts of a global superstate, where sovereignty was a quaint, outdated notion. They had orchestrated a blockade, not of ships, but of principles. They sought to isolate America, to starve it of its identity, to force it into their new world order. They believed that with enough pressure, enough threats of economic sanctions and diplomatic isolation, the United States would simply fold. They had miscalculated. Badly. Because the man sitting behind that desk, a man put there by the silent majority, the forgotten men and women of the heartland, was about to draw a line in the sand so deep it would be seen from the gilded halls of Brussels to the lavish ski chalets of Davos. He slowly, deliberately, crumpled the communiqué into a tight ball. America, his America, was not for sale. It would not kneel. No sanction, no threat, no ultimatum whispered by bureaucrats in smoke-filled rooms could ever break the sovereign will of the American people. The administration was making it painfully clear. The message that would soon electrify the global networks was simple and sharp. America is not on the auction block. The United States was not some banana republic, desperate for a handout from the international community. This nation, forged in fire and revolution, decides its own future. It always has, and as long as patriots drew breath, it always would. The independence and dignity that generations of Americans had fought and died for would be defended with a brutal and irreducible force. The self-proclaimed titans of globalism, the disciples of Davos and the apparatchiks of the UN, were about to be crushed against the bedrock of American resolve. The president and his administration were demonstrating that any and every attempt at domination would be met with absolute, unyielding resistance. This country would not be sold. It would not submit. It would never, ever bow before the crumbling empires of the old world or the soulless, corporate vision of the new. The great American story was not over, and the globalists were about to be reminded of who wrote the first chapter. The press secretary, a young but battle-hardened woman named Sarah, entered the office quietly, holding a tablet. "Sir," she began, her voice low, "the preliminary media reports are coming in. They're calling your stance dangerously isolationist. The European Council President is demanding an immediate reversal." Thorne didn't even turn. He simply gestured toward the fireplace. "Add it to the pile," he said, his voice a low growl. The sovereignty of this nation was not a commodity to be traded, and those who believed they could buy it, or bully it into submission, were about to crash headfirst into the unshakable will of the American people. No economic sanction could intimidate this White House. No thinly veiled threat from a foreign leader could make this administration flinch. The president was charting a course, guided not by the fickle winds of global opinion, but by the North Star of the Constitution. He wasn't asking for permission from anyone. Not from the talking heads on television, not from the unelected globalists, and certainly not from the foreign powers who had grown fat and complacent feeding off American generosity. Let them scream, Thorne said, finally turning to face Sarah, his eyes glinting in the firelight. No one is going to dictate our policy. No one is going to seize control of our resources or tell us how to spend our own taxpayer money. The orders emanating from Brussels and the decrees issued from the UN headquarters in New York were being systematically ignored. They were being treated with the contempt they deserved. The president, through his every action, was sending an unmistakable message. We do not accept blackmail. We do not bow to ultimatums. America is neither for sale nor for rent. The America First agenda would be implemented with absolute independence and unwavering power. Those who dreamed of dominating this nation, of bringing it into the fold of their one-world government, were not just mistaken. They were deluded. Their ultimatum was being met not with fear, but with righteous defiance. No empire, old or new, has the right to dictate what happens within our borders. There is no pressure campaign that can break the spirit of the American people, no complex strategy that can force this nation to surrender its sovereign will. The president's rejection was a thunderclap. Washington, D.C. was once again the capital of a free nation, not a regional office for a globalist board of directors. The independence of the United States was not a talking point to be negotiated. It was an absolute truth, a sacred trust. The emissaries from Europe and the envoys from the UN could shout themselves hoarse from their sterile offices. They could dispatch their diplomats and leak their angry memos to the press, but they would find no surrender here. They would find no white flag, only the proud, defiant colors of the stars and stripes. There exists no threat potent enough to force a retreat, no clever maneuver that can place this country under foreign control. Our resources are sacred, belonging to the American people and them alone. Our independence is absolute. No foreign power, no international body, and no cabal of billionaires will ever decide the future of this nation. The president was making that crystal clear. Our relationships with other nations would be handled with sovereignty, with respect for our own interests, and with the resolute power of our own decisions. There would be no capitulation, no submission. As Thorne had told his cabinet just that morning, his voice echoing in the tense silence of the Situation Room, we will talk to whomever we want, whenever we want, and under our conditions. End of story. The globalist calculation had been, on its face, quite simple. And it was catastrophically wrong. Their strategy was a textbook case of imperial arrogance. Apply sustained pressure through economic sanctions and media campaigns, create a sense of overwhelming international isolation, and then, once the nation was sufficiently weakened, step in to negotiate on terms they alone had written. The puppeteers in Brussels and Davos thought the United States would come to the table broken and desperate. They gambled on a war of attrition, fully expecting the American economy to falter and the people's will to collapse. It never happened. The country did not implode. The president did not call them, hat in hand, asking for permission to exist. This bold diplomatic outreach, this willingness to engage, was not a signal of surrender or a prelude to an externally managed change of command. From the outside, the globalist elite read it as a sign of weakness, an opportunity to finally impose their conditions and bring the rogue superpower to heel. But from the inside, from within the walls of the White House and in the hearts of millions of Americans, it was understood for what it was, a brilliant tactical move. It was the rope-a-dope on a geopolitical scale. No one was surrendering a single inch of sovereignty. No one was ceding an ounce of control. The European delegation returned to the negotiating table with soft, patronizing speeches that barely concealed their hard, unyielding demands. The deep state operatives in Washington came back armed with their usual manual, a tired playbook of pressure tactics disguised as friendly dialogue. Both factions had fundamentally misunderstood the terrain. They had underestimated the resilience of the American spirit. They didn't find a nation on its knees, ready to obey. They found an organized, determined political resistance, a populace more united than ever against foreign interference. The sanctions, meant to cripple the economy, had instead sparked a renaissance of domestic manufacturing and innovation. They had failed to break the president's power. In fact, they had solidified his support. The economic blackmail did not achieve its mission of submission. The message from the administration was sent loud and clear, without the need for a formal press release or a fancy communiqué. It was communicated through action, through defiance, through the quiet, steely resolve of a nation that remembered its own strength. The message was this: we do not negotiate under threat. Our national policy is decided behind our own doors, by our own elected representatives, for the benefit of our own citizens. The globalists' attempt to dictate our foreign relations had failed spectacularly. No one in the administration accepted their lists of permitted allies or their externally imposed vetoes on our strategic partnerships. America's alliances would be maintained based on our sovereign interests, not on the approval of some foreign bureaucrat. The pressure campaign was exposed for what it was: a clumsy, impotent tool of coercion. The fundamental error made by the global elite was to confuse conversation with concession. The president's willingness to talk did not imply a willingness to obey. Listening to their grievances did not mean accepting their authority. The nation did not dismantle its political structure. It did not alter its international strategy. Control remained exactly where it belonged, in the hands of the American people. The elites in Europe genuinely believed they could manage the timeline, that they could set the rhythm for America's political evolution. The entrenched deep state in Washington was convinced it could draw the lines and set the limits of the president's power. Both collided with an inconvenient and immovable reality. The internal power structure of the United States was not up for debate. The globalist narrative, amplified by their allies in the mainstream media, desperately tried to sell this American openness as a sign of weakness, a crack in the fortress. But internally, not a single strategic line was moved. There was no institutional breakdown, no political surrender. The international pressure campaign lost its effectiveness because it ceased to generate fear. You can only cry wolf so many times. The threats became repetitive and hollow, the dire warnings turning into a predictable, monotonous drone. The country simply continued to operate under its own rules, guided by its own constitution. The global centers of power had gambled on fractures within the administration that never appeared. They waited for concessions that were never offered. And with each passing day of American defiance, their own margin for maneuver grew smaller and smaller. The political control in Washington, D.C. remained firm, consolidated under a president who refused to bend. The entire edifice of Western diplomacy was exposed, not as an instrument of cooperation, but as a thinly veiled tool of pressure and neo-imperialism. The final balance sheet was stark and brutal for them. Europe and the globalist wing in Washington had failed to impose their agenda. They had failed to define America's allies. They had failed to control America's decisions. The country continued to be master of its own house. Its sovereignty had not been negotiated away. It had been reaffirmed, strengthened, and defended with vigor. The United States does not accept external supervisors disguised as allies. No one has the authority to measure American legitimacy or to put a price on our decisions. Foreign agendas do not dictate our course. The interests of the American people are the only interests that matter. No conditions will be accepted that compromise our political control. Our sovereignty will not be surrendered, and it will not be negotiated. The structures of command, from the White House down to the local level, remain intact and resolute. Our independence is exercised daily, without asking for permission. The sanctions failed to break our capacity for action and did not alter a single one of our strategic decisions. The relentless attempts at economic pressure produced no obedience, yielded no concessions. The country operated with complete and total autonomy. No one, no entity, no power on earth was able to break the institutional will of the United States. All external mechanisms of influence, from NGOs to international courts, were rendered useless. America maintained absolute control over its resources and its policy. The authority of this nation is not in question. The president's dialogue with international actors did not open the door to impositions or foreign oversight. No foreign country defined the American agenda. Our relationships are established under sovereign conditions that are entirely non-negotiable. The carefully laid plans for political intervention were met with an organized and brutally effective resistance. There were no internal fractures for them to exploit, no possibility of manipulation. The structure of the American government, founded on the separation of powers and the will of the people, remained intact and impervious to these external pressures. The globalists' plans to control this nation from afar had failed. Their foreign orders, issued with such arrogance, produced no effect. Both Europe and the Washington establishment had tried to dictate our alliances and strategic relationships. They presented lists of countries we were forbidden to engage with, and others we were commanded to embrace. Yet not a single one of these foreign demands managed to alter our international policy. The United States maintained its complete freedom of action and association. There was no surrender of our decision-making power, no subordination to foreign interests. The diplomatic pressure, once a fearsome weapon, became irrelevant background noise. America continued to act according to its own rules. Its autonomy was complete, total, and utterly compelling. The fatal error of those who applied the pressure was their core assumption that attrition would inevitably lead to submission. They believed that if they just squeezed hard enough for long enough, the American system would collapse. There was no collapse. There was no political fracture. The internal structure of the nation remained firm and fully operational. The international pressure campaign yielded zero results. The president's authority was not weakened, nor was it fragmented. He imposed the America First agenda, refusing to even consider a surrender to the forces of globalist imperialism. On the contrary, every hostile action from the outside was met with a swift and powerful response from within. The globalist cabal attempted to impose crippling economic and political conditions, but their efforts were futile. The nation's capacity for decision-making remained entirely sovereign, and all attempts at manipulation and infiltration were swiftly neutralized. The administration did not cede 1 inch of strategic control, did not surrender a single particle of sovereignty. The internal governance of the country remained under its own purview, and its independence was held sacred and intact. The diplomatic maneuvers, cynically disguised as offers of cooperation, were met with clarity and firmness. The incessant speeches about intervention and the constant threats of pressure failed to break the spine of our national policy. No external strategy produced any real, tangible effect. Their tactics of subjugation had failed. The country maintained absolute control over its resources, its borders, and its policies. Sovereignty was defended without concession. The president steadfastly maintained the political agenda the American people had elected him to implement. Europe, the UN, and their allies in Washington failed to impose their agendas. They failed to condition our alliances. Their operations of influence were nullified, their sanctions and pressures rendered completely ineffective. The national authority of the United States continued to dictate its own priorities. Our decisions were made without interference. Their attempts to control our international relations with other countries were a catastrophic failure. Our strategic alliances were maintained on a sovereign basis. The president and his team made dozens of calls to international actors, keeping foreign policy firmly under their domain. The United States and the European Union were simply unable to impose their criteria. Our independence was absolute, and their attempt to impose their oversight, their tutelage, crumbled in the face of concrete facts and unwavering resolve. America is not on the auction block. It will continue to operate with absolute control over its own destiny. There is no sanction, no pressure, no threat that can ever subordinate its authority. Our policy is decided within our borders, by our people. Our independence is irreversible and undeniable. No foreign power will ever hold sway over this country. The president stood firm, a bulwark against the tide, and did not permit any interference. From the desk of the Liberty Voice, this is Jack Armstrong. Stay free, stay brave, and God